This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Good to be with you, as always, Sam.
Fine to have you here on this wet Tuesday morning as we record this. I was thinking...
That's good to know. We're making progress.
Yes. Slow and steady wins the race, as they say. But I was thinking, as it happens, on the rare occasion the other day that, oftentimes when we're, following the Lord, and I think especially when we start out on a new venture, whether that's, you felt God leading you to start a ministry or to do a particular thing, maybe even plant a church or, even take your business or your organization in a direction that maybe seems scary, but it's the way that God is leading you. When you do that and things are humming along, sometimes you just it seems ambushed or just bushwhacked, taken off guard by, some difficulty, some pressure, some persecution. And I think that can be very disorienting.
It can. Yeah. It's one thing if you're living in sin, if you know you're doing something wrong, you almost expect at some point God's going to lower the boom. And you can anticipate, okay, I can only probably go so far this way till God's going to, kind of get my attention in some way. But what confuses us is when we're doing everything right. We're obeying God. We're pleasing to God. We're not resisting. We're trying to do what He told us to do. And then when all of a sudden we get hit by a crisis, that's confusing. It's like, well, why would God do that? And especially when you're attempting to do good things. Maybe you tried to start a company and you're going to operate it on Christian principles, and you're going to try to be a blessing to your staff and your clients, and you're going to do it all to the glory of God. You're going to maybe tithe on your profits to support missions. I mean, it's just this perfect kind of scenario. And then all of a sudden the bottom falls out of the economy, or you get cheated by a major customer and face financial hardship. And you think, well, Lord, why would you let that happen? I was doing all this for you. I was trying to glorify you. Shouldn't God protect you from those kind of circumstances?
Yeah, well, I think when we think about it, we think, if I was God, I wouldn't let my best helpers or my best servants face this difficulty, especially when they're being obedient.
Yeah, well, and certainly because there's a lot of Christians out there who aren't serving God. They're not being obedient. And so here's one who is. I mean, shouldn't you sort of open a clear path for them to be successful?
Where are those storehouses?
They're actually tithing and giving money to the church and God's causes. Like, help them be more successful, make more money. It'll be more money going to the church. And of course, this has always been a case, and throughout the Bible, just the whole story of the Israelite people is a story of this. I mean, their entire history is one of trials and tribulations and suffering, of all manner of suffering. And there's just many stories throughout the Bible of people that were trying to do the right thing, and then hardships came. You think about someone like David. He's anointed to be the king, and he's a giant killer. He's willing to take on Goliath. He's willing to take a stand for God, do everything right. And then all of a sudden, the king at the time, King Saul, becomes paranoid and tries to kill him, and he has to run for his life. It's like, well, what has David done to deserve that? I mean, he's fought against God's enemies. He's trusted God when no one else would, and his reward is run for your life. You don't know who is going to betray you or when Saul's henchmen might come upon you. You think about Elijah. He goes and delivers a very difficult message to King Ahab, and as a result, he's a fugitive for the next several years. You think about people like Peter and John. They, after Pentecost, they're growing the church and they're ministering for God. And then what happens? They get arrested, thrown in jail. And then James ultimately gets beheaded. And you think, well, wait a minute, this church is just kind of getting started here, and they're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to be a good witness. Why do you keep throwing all the key leaders in jail and even killing some of them? And so that's just an ongoing, I think, issue that every Christian wrestles with. And it's just pretty hard not to say you don't wrestle with that, because when you're walking with the Lord and you're having great quiet times and you're spending time praying and ministering to others, maybe you teach a Bible study at your church and you faithfully giving and so on, and you're living a moral life, you're trying to honor God in your thoughts and your words and your actions, and then all of a sudden you get laid off your job or you lose a major customer. And your car suddenly you go out and find your car has been hit by somebody who's left the scene, and now you've got all kinds of damage to take care of, and you can just turn and say, God, I thought you loved me, I thought you cared about me, I thought you were going to protect me. Why have you let this happen? And so there's just lots and lots of ways where that can happen. And I've known some church planters that they tried to start a church, and they were obviously doing it to honor God, to extend His kingdom, and then COVID hit, and they couldn't even meet in person, and donors may be dried up. And I know many a church planter who started a church in 2019, 2020 that had to they just closed their doors during COVID and said, if I'd known that this was coming, I never would have tried to start a church. Or I've known people that committed to financially support missionaries and to give regular support to various ministries, and then they faced a huge financial crisis. And it's like, God, I'm trying to support financially all these different worthy Christian causes, and now all of a sudden I've got way less cash flow because of this crisis. What happened? Or maybe you felt led to go to a new job and you got there, and then you discovered that there's a colleague there who thinks they should have had your job, and they're jealous and resentful, and they're antagonistic toward you. And you're like, I prayed about this. I felt God wanted me in this job, but it's just been nothing but hostile ever since I got here. So lots and lots of different scenarios where you think you're doing God's will, and then as you start walking down that path, all of a sudden things get worse instead of better.
Well, I think we perhaps mistakenly equate obedience to God with the easy path.
Yeah.
We think, well, if we do the right thing, then God sort of responds in kind and opens the doors and smooths out the rough spots, and we just go through, because the hard thing was being obedient. And
you're supposed to be rewarded, right? God rewards obedience, and you can't reward obedience by making someone's life harder. You reward them by making it easier. And so why does God do that? And I think just the rest of our time, I want us to look at just several reasons. And I'm not trying to provide just pat answers. There's lots of reasons. God always has multiple reasons for why He does what He does. But a couple that I would just point out, at least to consider, because I suspect that some of our listeners probably can identify with this. You may right now be going through a difficult time, and at least in the back of your mind wonder, why did God allow this to happen to me? He could have let an atheist experience this. Why not just give all the problems to unbelievers? But why does He let some of His choicest servants go through some of the worst suffering?
Yeah.
So, first one I would just say is, our primary calling is not to have an easy life. It is to glorify God. And God knows in any moment in your life how to get the maximum glory from you. And sadly, sometimes God gets more glory from our life when we're going through difficult times and still trusting Him than when our life is kind of sailing along carefree. And so just remember that when you ask, well, why would a loving God let me suffer? Well, ask yourself, well, if my primary purpose is to glorify God, then wouldn't a loving God let me go through whatever it took to bring the most glory to Him? And I think we really struggle with that sometimes. It's like, well, I'm happy to bring glory to God as long as that means that I'm financially better off than I've ever been. But losing my money, losing my savings or my business, and yet loving God just as much and trusting Him just as much, that probably is going to bring more glory to God. It's just going to be a lot more painful for us. How much do you want to glorify God? And then, there's a second one. That is, our primary calling is not even necessarily about what we do for God, but that how we relate to God. In John 15, it talks about abiding in Christ, just being so closely related to Him. That is our calling. It's kind of like the Mary and Martha syndrome. We keep being drawn to doing stuff like Martha, but our primary calling is to abide in Christ like Mary. And of course, you can do that. See, that's what often confuses us. It's like, well, I was able to do so much more for God when I had money, when I had a job, when I had my health, when I wasn't being persecuted this way. Now I'm doing a lot less for God. But God would say, well, your primary calling is not what you do anyway. It's how you abide. And you may have lost your job, you might have lost your money, you might have lost your health, but you can still abide in me just as much as you always have. And so if you realize His primary, because that's what confuses us. It's like, well, God, I was able to give a lot more money to my church when I was, earning all kinds of extra bonuses at work, and now I've lost all that. But God might say, but you can still abide in me just as much as you ever have.
Yeah.
And I'm not dependent upon your money to get my work done. What I want is for you to abide. And I'll tell you what, for those of us, especially if we're leaders or we're in business, when God tells us the thing that delights Him most is just simply our abiding in Him, we get a little antsy and want to say, yeah, but I'm God. Abiding is all good and fine, but I can't do stuff for you right now.
It's not very productive, is it?
Yeah, it's not productive. But maybe one other one is just, God's primary focus is on the spiritual, not the material. And a lot of times our frustration is with the material world. Money, homes, cars, jobs, the things that we can touch and see. And when those things are taken from us, when those things suffer damage or theft or whatever else, they loom large in our world. But really, we're made for a spirit world. Heaven will be a spiritual place. The things that really matter, that are eternal, are spirit. Jesus even said we are to worship God in spirit and truth. But because we live in a physical world, the physical things, the material things mean a lot to us, probably more than they should. And so a lot of our suffering has to do with physical realities. But when your mind becomes spiritually minded, you realize that the spiritual world is still very accessible to you. And you can still have great success with spiritual things, even maybe if physical, material things you're not doing so well. And that's always a little, I think in part what God is trying to do is free us from our dependency upon the physical and to make us not rely so much on it. And I think that's partly why it's so difficult, Jesus said, for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, because they're just they're surrounded by material things that can very much entrap us and captivate us. And sometimes God just frees us from some of our material possessions. For years I had a car I really enjoyed and drove into the ground. And as I got older, I kind of hated to, get to the point where it wasn't very reliable anymore. So my first thought was, I need to buy another nice car that I can really enjoy. And God really just kind of told me, you know what, you and your wife could probably get by with just one vehicle right now. And you don't need, just because that material possession is kind of coming to the end of its time, doesn't mean you need to automatically renew it, get a replacement. Maybe at least for a time, just try living without that material possession in your world, your life. And I think sometimes God just tries to free us from some things, to say, it's not that physical possessions are evil, but you can easily begin to depend upon them or to like them too much. And if that happens, it may seem unfair, unkind. Why did God let me lose this house, lose this job, lose this income? But God would say, because I don't want you to be dependent upon it. Yours is a spiritual world, a spiritual reality. You're just passing through this physical world. So sometimes God allows some hardship, some loss, just to keep us free and traveling light through this world.
I think we're far more in tune with the spiritual reality when our physical reality suffers, and I think that's certainly the case. Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Richard Blackaby. I'm the co-author of Experiencing God. And here at the Blackaby Bible Institute, we're offering an online class of Experiencing God that people can take from around the world. No one had any idea back in 1990 when Experiencing God was first published that it would be so life-transforming and that people would experience revival. They'd be set free from burdens they'd carried for years. I can't go anywhere in the world without people telling me how this material has changed their life. And so we offer it as the Blackabys, where we have all kinds of video resources, a live stream where you can submit live questions and get answers from myself and others, and just many different resources that will enhance your experience of Experiencing God. So I want to encourage you, if you've never taken the class before, or even if you have, the Blackaby Bible Institute will offer you more resources than you could have gotten anywhere else. And so we look forward to studying with you, and we're praying that it will change your life as you do.
Well, I know we don't, if we were God, we would do things differently, and thankfully none of us are, because I think we would soon ruin that position. And one of those ways is just when we face spiritual, or when we face material difficulties, like we said before the break, oftentimes that's when our spiritual eyes begin to be opened, and that reality becomes more in focus as God intended. But we've got a few more ways in which God uses those difficulties, even when we are being obedient, to draw us even closer to Him.
Yeah. Well, I think a fourth one is just remember that God is always trying to build your character. And character building often comes better through pain than through comfort. And I think for most of us, we might say, when I've become more humble, when I've become more compassionate, maybe more loving, it's not been when everything was going my way, but when I suffered loss, I suffered pain. And so, you're put into the fire, you're put in the crucible, and that's not comfortable at the time. But coming out the other side so often, don't measure your hardship right now while you just suffered the loss and the being laid off work or whatever else it is. Wait till you get to the other side and then look back and say, what was my character like as I went into that crisis? What is it like now? And maybe God did a beautiful thing. It was painful. I didn't really want it to happen, but looking back, I realized God was working on my character the whole time, and the result is, I may not have as much money in the bank now, but I've got a better character. A fifth one is just that God also sometimes lets you go through hardship in order to be a witness. It's fine for Christians to try to say to people at work who are not Christians, boy, you should accept Christ, He'll change your life. And we often tend to think, well, if God just makes me very successful and I've got the nicest car in the company parking lot, everybody else will want to be a Christian like me. But if they see that you've not been treated well by the boss, you were cheated by a business partner, and yet you continued to have joy, you continued to have faith, you weren't angry and resentful and bitter toward those who mistreated you, but you were forgiving and gracious and kind and loving. That speaks volumes to people watching you. And you just have to remember when you're going to work and there's other colleagues that are around you every day that are not believers, they're watching you to try to figure out just how real is this Christianity of yours. And oftentimes they won't know that it's real till they watch it pass through the fire. And so sometimes God is allowing you to suffer because it will perhaps bring others into faith in Christ. Of course, he let his own son suffer
Yeah.
for the salvation of others. If he let his own son go to a cross, don't ever think or assume that he would not let you carry a cross as he holds your life up before the people around you.
Well, and so often throughout history, the church has really only grown or exploded when it's faced great persecution and great difficulty.
Yeah.
It's through those hard times that the world looks at Christians and says, okay, maybe there is something to that God of theirs.
Yeah. And like you watch them like trusting God even as they're being, brought out to the lions in the Colosseum or
Exactly.
being killed and yet saying, but I won't turn from Christ no matter what. That says a lot to people, that they have to begin to wonder that they really meant that. That's not just a fad. That's not just a kind of a little idiosyncrasy of theirs. They really believe this to be true. So that may well be a part of it. A sixth thing is just remember God made you for eternity, not time. Some of the losses, some of the suffering that we go through is painful in the moment, but in light of eternity, it's just a blink. It's so temporary. Even painful suffering, and there are some very painful things that people suffer physically, and yet in light of eternity, it's not very long, and it's very brief. And then for eternity, you are with God, and so you kind of have to examine and evaluate your suffering, your hardships in light of eternity. That it doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but it puts it in the right perspective. And then also a seventh thing is just remember that God's measure of success is different than ours. Our measure of success often is a lot like the world's. It's how much money did we end up with? How big was our house? How nice was our car? How nice, expensive were our clothes and our jewelry and watches and so on. But God's measure of success is very different. Were you obedient to what God asked you to do? Did you raise your family well? I've shared before talking with a wealthy CEO that lost a lot of money just with some people that cheated him, kind of embezzled money, cheated him, left him holding the bag, and he lost a fortune that he had saved up throughout his career. And he felt like a failure. He'd worked all of his life, made lots of good money, and then he had very little money to show for it at the end. But he had a very loving marriage, a godly wife who supported him through the most difficult times he had. He had a couple of kids who all loved him, respected him, who all loved God, were all walking with God, grandkids that were growing up to love God with all their hearts. He was surrounded by godly, loving people who respected him and thought highly of him, even more highly because of watching him continue to hold on to his faith during that horrible time in his life. And I tried to encourage him to say, hey, listen, you, in God's perspective and his measuring stick, your life's very successful. All your kids and grandkids are going to join you in heaven one day. You're going to celebrate for an eternity. And your character has grown and you become more like Christ. You, all the boxes that really matter for God, you're checking them all off, saying you're very successful. God does not measure your success by how much money you end up with, by what your tax bracket is. That's not on even the list that God has for success. And so be careful that you're measuring your life with the same measuring stick that God uses in terms of success. And then an eighth thing, there's a verse that's probably no one's favorite verse, where in Philippians 3, verse 10, Paul says he wants to know the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. And there just is something very deep, very profound about actually experiencing in some small degree the sufferings of Christ. For some reason, God the Father just determined that the only way to accomplish his purposes was for his own son to suffer excruciatingly on a cross. And there is a sense, Paul said, in which every time you suffer, even as you're doing and following the will of God in your life, that you share in the sufferings of Christ. And of course, it's great to share in the joys of Christ, in the peace of Christ, the power of Christ. But to fully know and experience Christ means that you also share in the sufferings. And I think for a lot of us, we would say, well, I don't really want to know Jesus that well. But to fully know and identify with Christ means you also have your own cross to take up. And I think for that really is the defining moment for a lot of us when it comes to just how far are you willing to go with Christ. And then maybe two final ones. A ninth one is just, as I've shared before, just remember this, that when you do suffer discomfort for Christ and doing Christ's will, he also will, he may not remove the pain from you, but he will provide comfort. He will provide peace. And I've said before, would you be willing to suffer discomfort if God himself were to personally comfort you in the process? He didn't take the pain away, but he spoke into your heart. He encouraged you. He loved you. He carried the load for you. If you had God as your nurse, if you had God as your personal physician to help you endure the pain and the suffering, would it be worth it? Would you rather have no pain, or would you rather have pain and have God intimately involved in your life helping you to deal with it? And there's only one way to experience God as your comforter, and that is when you experience discomfort. There's only one way to experience God as your healer, and that means you have to have been sick. And so there are some aspects to knowing and experiencing God that only can occur when you've gone through difficult times. And then the last one I would just say, it's no small thing, but out of your suffering, out of your hardship, you are able to empathize with others who've gone through similar things. And it's Christians, I think God calls us to be caring and thoughtful people, but it's hard sometimes if you've never had anything go wrong in your life to really be able to empathize with those who have had lots of things go wrong. And that doesn't mean you have to, suffer every solitary ailment so you can sympathize with others. But I think having had, at least in some area of your life, a major setback yourself can help you better empathize with those who've also experienced that. It's just hard if everything you've touched has always turned to gold, and then you see someone in your church who's unemployed, who's been just having difficulty with getting enough money to make ends meet. There's just a certain part of us somewhere within that just kind of says, well, if they just worked harder, they just been smarter, like they could be as successful as me. And that may not necessarily be true. They may have had some just misfortune. They might have been lied to, deceived, betrayed. Maybe their home life just did not set them up with the kind of education that yours set you up with. And so I think sometimes just to keep our feet on the ground, just to help us to not be too high on ourselves and looking too down on others, God kind of helps us have our own setbacks in some way, just to kind of keep our feet on the ground. And before we're too quick just to dismiss others for their shortcomings, we are just have something in our life that reminds us of our own frail humanity as well, that makes us realize we're just fortunate that we don't have more problems than we do. And God's been gracious, and there's certainly some very capable, intelligent people out there whose life has been far more difficult than mine has been. And so I'm just grateful to God, even in the midst of, my problems. A lot of us have got problems, but there's a lot of people who'd be happy to trade problems with us.
Yeah.
And so I think it's sometimes good just to know that. No, before I complain too much about my problems, I think I'll go ahead and keep them, because I don't have to look too far to see others who've got far worse problems than me.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a great reminder that when you follow the Lord, it's not always sunshine and butterflies, but there are difficulties. But on the other side of those, I think none of us would trade those hard times because of the intimacy that affords us with God through the difficulty. So thanks for taking us through this, Richard, and until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.